For
Dad would probably say, now is the time. We must preserve, protect, and expand democracy. We must ensure that voting rights is protected for all people. We must ensure that our women and children are treated fairly. We must end gun violence. Maybe one day we will be a great nation.
Well, today marks 60 years since Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led the March on Washington. It marked the call to action against racial injustice, inequity, poverty, systemic oppression, and attempts to undermine democracy in the U.S. Today, that mission is still underway. On August 28, 1963, Dr. King was one of the many speakers who compelled leaders in Washington and across the country to join the fight for equal rights. Tracy Robinson English joins us now to speak more about the voices that really shaped that momentous day in American history. She is a professor with the Meadows School of Journalism at Northwestern University. Thanks so much for making time, and good morning.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So much to get to. I want to start with this. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. It is still one of the most recognizable, well-known speeches in American history. What was really the core of that message that day, and what was its impact on Washington?
Well, Chanel, I think you touched on it when you said that it was a demand and an urgency for legal action by the government to address some of the wrongs in this country. You have to understand that, we were living in the backdrop of segregation in this country, Jim Crow, lynching, all of these things were still occurring. Whites-only signs were everywhere throughout the country. And Black Americans and people of color were made to feel like exiles in our country. So while the demonstration itself was peaceful and respectful, and people gathered for a nonviolent rally of hope, it was also a call to urgency. And that's what Martin Luther King's speech was really all about, a demand for John F. Kennedy and Congress to take legal actions to correct some of the ills in this country.
And, some people probably don't know, Tracy, that some of the more iconic parts of the I Have a Dream speech were actually improvised. What does this tell you about the kind of orator Dr. King was? Do you think he could have sort of conceptualized in that moment just how big the moment was going to be?
Well, I had an opportunity to talk with my pastor, Reverend Otis Moss of Trinity United Church of Christ here in Chicago, who is a renowned theologian and historian. And we all know that Martin Luther King was a great orator himself. But at this particular point, when he's talking in his speech, I Have a Dream, it was totally improvisational. He remembered a prayer from Reverend Prathia Hall of Albany, Georgia, and he used the refrain in his speech, I Have a Dream, that really began to arouse the crowd and to really get them on their feet about the future of America. And he says that, it was that point where he began to really let loose and talk about his vision and his dreams for the future. The speech was really a critique of white supremacy in America, and that often gets lost in the I Have a Dream speech, because those final 5 minutes of the speech is really arousing, but people really lose the core message that we were really talking about ending and eradicating the Ku Klux Klan in the mountaintops of Georgia. We were also talking about trying to eradicate economic discriminations throughout the country, where we had just horrible poverty throughout the country, and people were living below minimum wage. So the fight for freedom in his speech were really about urgency and a call for action by the government to address many of these problems in the civil rights bill that finally became law.
This is such an important point, right, Tracy? It wasn't just a lofty dream. There were specific calls to action there. King was also joined alongside other activists, including John Lewis, who we know was just 23 years old that day. I want to play you just a little bit of that speech.
It is true that we support the administration's civil rights bill. We support it with great reservation, however. Unless Title 3 is put in this bill, there's nothing to protect the young children and old women who must face police dogs and fire hoses in the South while they engage in peaceful demonstration. In its present form, this bill will not protect the citizen of Danville, Virginia, who must live in constant fear of a police state. It will not protect the hundreds and thousands of people who have been arrested upon Trump charges.
So Lewis, as we know, went on to serve as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, also remained really at the forefront of the civil rights movement through legislative action. That was until his death in 2020. In that sound there, Tracy, we hear Lewis referencing what would later become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You mentioned that piece of legislation. Tell us a bit more about what this really means.
Well, the legislation was really the glue that began to cement some of the changes in legislation around race, around discrimination. It was really calling for an end of discrimination in public places such as hotels. African Americans could not, enter the front of hotels or many restaurants. And it was also a call for better wages so that people could move from poverty into the mainstream. So this was an opportunity for the government in this act to finally move toward some real positive change toward making African Americans really become more the mainstream.
Okay, Tracy Robinson English, thanks so much for your time and your insight. We appreciate this. And our coverage marking 60 years since the March on Washington continues all day here on CBS News. We'll take a closer look at the activism since then, the fight for voting rights, and the issues of social injustice and police brutality.